There's no way to escape the room. They can subdue the inflation, but at the cost of a very severe recession, not a mild recession, a very severe recession. So the question is, to me, the biggest question in economics is, will the Fed go down that path, do what they have to do the only thing they can do to subdue inflation at the cost of a very severe recession and something like a stock market crash? Or will they see that coming? They'll be the last to know. We'll all see it before they do, but they'll be the last to know. It's because they rely on flood models, and they're kind of in their own economic forecasting bubble, and they're very defective ways of thinking about the economy, and they're very much a creature of inertia. There are a whole lot of reasons why the Fed is not nimble. It's kind of quite the opposite. But they'll see it eventually, probably when it's too late. And will they balk at that point and stop rate hikes and maybe even reduce rates? That could save us from the recession, but that will just amplify the inflation. So rather than say which one's going to happen, I prefer to lay out those two paths and then just watch it very carefully. But more to the point, we've seen this movie before. This is a replay, and I think it's on, like you hit the remote control for double or triple speed. It's going to happen faster, but this is a replay of everything that happened from 2013 to 2019 and into 2020.
What happened between 2013 and into 2020 was a massive injection of liquidity, free purchasing power in the financial markets by the world's central banks. In particular, during 2020, the central banks, led by the Fed, have helped governments spend a lot of money to support the economy and markets during the lockdowns. Now we are witnessing the cost of these programs, decades-high inflation across the world. Reducing inflation will come at a great cost. Stagflation, wrote hedge fund manager Ray Dalio in a recent LinkedIn update. Dalio expressed frustration that many so-called experts are getting the drivers of inflation and how to deal with it wrong. Hearing supposed experts talk about what's now happening in the markets and economy is like listening to nails scratch against a chalkboard because they are typically saying incorrect things in an erudite rather than common sense way, Dalio wrote. Across many countries, the CPI has increased year on year. In the US, the latest figure as of August 16, 2022 stood at 8.8%. The Eurozone recorded 8.9% annual increase in the CPI. Norway saw a 7% increase, and even in China, consumer prices have hit a 2-year high. Overall across the world, the inflation of consumer prices was up from 1.9% in 2020 to 3.4% in 2021. The PPI has also gone up in a number of economies. For example, in the UK, the ONS, or the Office for National Statistics, reported that producer input prices rose by 22.1% in the year to May 2022, up from 20.9% in the year to April 2022. This is the highest the rate has been since records began in January 1985. Similar dynamics can be spotted in the US and across most of the Eurozone. Meanwhile, the forward-looking PMI, as recent as the 12th of August 2022, according to analysis done by S&P, has indicated a general slowdown in growth as the economic environment faces headwinds from geopolitical uncertainty, high inflation, and supply constraints.
Price of goods moves either because there's not enough supply, which is what we've had a problem with, or it's because there's too much or not enough demand. So if you've got something with restricted supply, so let's think of oil right now. Because of the Russian situation, there is not enough oil for the current demand out there. So the oil price keeps going up. So you and I pay more to drive our cars or to heat or cool our houses. So the only way of solving that one, because you can't get the Russian oil back into the market, is to make us use less oil. So that the price does that automatically because it gets more expensive, we do it. But if you can also then just lower general demand for things, we'll drive our cars less, we'll catch less flights, all of that stuff, and that lowers demand and therefore prices. Because prices rising, inflation, is evil for our savings because the dollar in your bank account is worth less in a year's time. It's currently worth 8% less, which is quite a lot.
Michael Leibowitz, founder of 720 Global, a consulting firm focused on macroeconomic research, stressed that the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of all central banks, warns inflation can remain persistent in high inflation regimes, a period it fears we are entering. Indeed, the hawkishness of major central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank, suggests that inflation is a serious threat, and it cannot be ignored. The New York Times reported that central banks in the US, Europe, Canada, and parts of Asia are lifting interest rates rapidly as they try to wrestle breakneck inflation under control. The Fed already increased its federal funds rate from 0.08% in February 2022 to almost 1.7% today, while the official interest rate in the UK reached 1.75% from 0.01%. The ECB too tightened its monetary policy stance. All of these actions signal the threat of inflation and the willingness of central banks to take it seriously. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, wrote in a recent blog post that, with risks to the inflation outlook tilted to the upside, central banks must continue normalizing to prevent inflationary pressures from becoming entrenched. They need to act resolutely to bring inflation back to their target, avoiding a de-anchoring of inflation expectations that would damage credibility built over the past decades. However, as Roy Dalio pointed out in his recent LinkedIn article, there is no free lunch in dealing with inflation. Rising interest rates will have massively destabilizing effects for financial markets and economies. The interest rate informs the valuation of risky assets, such as equities, the amount paid on debt, the level of which is insane as global debt stands at about $226 trillion, and the rate received on savings deposited on banks, among other things. Dalio concluded that there isn't anything that the Fed can do to fight inflation without creating economic weakness, with debt assets and liabilities as high as they are and projected to increase due to the government deficit, and the Fed also selling government debt. It is likely that private credit growth will have to contract, weakening the economy, and over the long run the Fed will most likely chart a middle course that will take the form of stagflation.
When you have so much debt that is also somebody's stored wealth, either the debtor or the creditor is going to pay. And it becomes very, very difficult to balance those two things for central banks. That's the challenge of having a lot of debt, which is a lot of financial assets, because that balancing act becomes difficult. So I think that right now, we have a problem in that a high enough interest rate to adequately control inflation or provide an adequate return to inflation is too high of an interest rate for the capital markets and for the economy. So I believe that we're entering a period which it's going to be very, very difficult for the Fed and for other central banks to try to find that right balance. They're going to navigate between those two things. Too tight means a bad economy, and too loose means a bad inflation. And I think that difference is going to produce more of a stagflation type of environment. This is particularly true internationally because internationally, a lot of the world is holding bonds because it's a reserve currency. If you want to save in a bond, if you want to save in dollars because you use it so much, you buy it and you save in it and you buy the bonds. But they're overweighted in dollars. So it's not certain. But it is a big, big risk that I think everybody's too casual about.
Let us know in the comments below what you think about the direction of inflation from here. Do you think that in trying to reduce inflation, governments and central banks will trigger a dramatic depression and market crash? As always, thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe for more.